Maroons were African refugees that escaped slavery in the Americas and formed independent settlements. The term can also be applied to their descendants. The same root word also gives us the English verb to maroon. History: in the New World, as early as 1512, black slaves had escaped from Spanish and Portuguese captors and either joined indigenous peoples or eked out a living on their own. Sir Francis Drake enlisted several cimarrones during his raids on the Spanish. As early as 1655, runaway slaves had formed their own communities in inland Jamaica, and by the 18th century, Nanny Town and other villages began to fight for independent recognition. When runaway slaves banded together and subsisted independently, they were called Maroons. On the Caribbean islands, runaway slaves formed bands and on some islands formed armed camps. Maroon communities faced great odds to survive against white attackers, obtain food for subsistence living, and to reproduce and increase their numbers. As the planters took over more land for crops, the Maroons began to vanish on the small islands. Only on some of the larger islands were organized Maroon communities able to thrive by growing crops and hunting. Here they grew in number as more slaves escaped from plantations and joined their bands. Seeking to separate themselves from whites, the Maroons gained in power and amid increasing hostilities, they raided and pillaged plantations and harassed planters until the planters began to fear a massive slave revolt. The early Maroon communities were usually displaced. By 1700, Maroons had disappeared from the smaller islands. Survival was always difficult as the Maroons had to fight off attackers as well as attempt to grow food. One of the most influential Maroons was Section-Wa Makandal, a Hungan, or voodoo priest, who led a 6-year rebellion against the white plantation owners in Haiti that preceded the Haitian Revolution. In Cuba, there were Maroon communities in the mountains, where African refugees who escaped the brutality of slavery and joined refugee tornos. Before roads were built into the mountains of Puerto Rico, heavy brush kept many escaped Maroons hidden in the southwestern hills where many also intermarried with the natives. Escaped Africans sought refuge away from the coastal plantations of Ponce. Remnants of these communities remain to this day, for example in Via +/- Cuba, and Adjuntas, Puerto Rico. Maroon communities emerged in many places in the Caribbean, but none was seen as such a great threat to the British as the Jamaican Maroons. A British governor signed a treaty promising them 2,500 acres in 2 locations, because they presented a threat to the British. Also, some Maroons kept their freedom by agreeing to capture runaway slaves. They were paid $2 for each slave returned. Beginning in the late 17th century, Jamaican Maroons fought British colonists to withdraw and eventually signed treaties in the 18th century that effectively freed them over 50 years before the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. To this day, the Jamaican Maroons are to a significant extent autonomous and separate from Jamaican society. The physical isolation used to their advantage by their ancestors has today led to their communities remaining among the most inaccessible on the island. In their largest town, Ocampo, in the parish of Street Elizabeth, the Leeward Maroons still possess a vibrant community of about 600. Tours of the village are offered to foreigners and a large festival is put on every January 6 to commemorate the signing of the peace treaty with the British after the First Maroon War. In Suriname, which the Dutch took over in 1667, runaway slaves revolted and started to build their own villages from the end of the 17th century. As most of the plantations existed in the eastern part of the country, near the Comuage River and Miroweed River, the marronage took place along the river borders and sometimes across the borders of French Guiana. By 1740 the Maroons had formed clans and felt strong enough to challenge the Dutch colonists, forcing them to sign peace treaties. On October 10, 1760, the Ndiuka signed such a treaty forged by Ndiuko Benti Basseton of Boston, a former Jamaican slave who had learnt to read and write and knew about the Jamaican Treaty. The treaty is still important, as it defines the territorial rights of the Maroons in the gold-rich inlands of Suriname. Culture. Slaves escaped frequently within the first generation of their arrival from Africa and often preserved their African languages and much of their culture and religion. African traditions include such things as the use of medicinal herbs together with special drums and dances when the herbs are administered to a sick person. Other African healing traditions and rites have survived through the centuries. The jungles around the Caribbean Sea offered food, shelter, and isolation for the escaped slaves. Maroons survived by growing vegetables and hunting. They also originally raided plantations. During these attacks, the Maroons would burn crops, steal livestock and tools, kill slave masters, and invite other slaves to join their communities. Individual groups of Maroons often allied themselves with the local indigenous tribes and occasionally assimilated into these populations. Maroons played an important role in the histories of Brazil, Suriname, Puerto Rico, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Jamaica. There is much variety among Maroon cultural groups because of differences in history, geography, African nationality, and the culture of indigenous people throughout the Western Hemisphere. Maroon settlements often possessed a clannish, outsider identity. They sometimes developed Creole languages by mixing European tongues with their original African languages. One such Maroon Creole language, in Suriname, is Saramaccan. Other times the Maroons would adopt the local European language as a common tongue, for members of the community frequently spoke a variety of mother tongues. The Maroons created their own independent communities which in some cases have survived for centuries and until recently remained separate from mainstream society. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Maroon communities began to disappear as forests were razed, although some countries, such as Guyana and Suriname, still have large Maroon populations living in the forests. Recently, many of them moved to cities and towns as the process of urbanization accelerates. Geographical distribution: North America, Florida. The Black Seminoles who allied with Seminole Indians in Florida, were one of the largest and most successful Maroon communities in the United States. Louisiana: until the mid-1760s, Maroon colonies lined the shores of Lake Borgne, just downriver of New Orleans, Louisiana. These fugitive slaves controlled many of the canals and backcountry passages from Lake Pontchartrain to the Gulf, including the Rigolettes. These colonies were finally eradicated by militia from Spanish-controlled New Orleans led by Francisco Bouligny. Free people of color aided in the capture of these fugitives. North Carolina and Virginia, a large settlement of the Great Dismal Swamp. Maroons lived in oppressive conditions in the marshlands of today's North Carolina and Virginia. Nova Scotia. From 1796 to 1800, 550 Maroons, who had been deported from Jamaica after the Second Maroon War, lived in Nova Scotia. In 1800, they were sent to Sierra Leone. Mexico, see Gaspayanga, Afro-Latin, Afro-Mexican. Asian, Maroon communities were formed among the Afro-Asians that resisted slavery. These communities of Maroons still inhabit the South Asian countries. Central America, Panama. A recently arrived slave, Bayano, led a rebellion in 1552 against the Spanish in Panama, and he and his followers escaped to found villages in the lowlands. Later these people, known as cimarrones, assisted Sir Francis Drake against the Spanish. Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. The Gulf of Honduras produced several types of Maroon societies. Some of these were found in the interior of modern-day Honduras along the trade routes by which silver mined in the Pacific side of the isthmus was carried down to coastal towns such as Trujillo or Puerto Cabellos to be shipped to Europe. The English Bishop of Guatemala, Thomas Gage, reported active bands of Maroons numbering in the hundreds along these routes in 1648. A second group that could be classified as Maroons were the Mosquito Sambu, who formed from revolted slaves on a Portuguese ship around 1640 who wrecked the vessel on the coast of Honduras, Nicaragua and blended in with the indigenous people over the next half-century. They eventually rose to leadership of the Mosquito Coast, and led extensive slave raids against Spanish-held territories in the first half of the 18th century. A third group were the Garifuna, who were actually Maroons on the island of St. Vincent deported to the coast of Honduras in 1797. From their original landing place in Roatan Island, the Garifuna moved on to Trujillo, and then groups of them spread south into the Mosquito Kingdom and north into Belize. Caribbean islands, Jamaica. Escaped slaves during the Spanish occupation of the island of Jamaica fled to the interior and joined the Tornos living there. Additional numbers fled during the confusion surrounding the 1655 British invasion. Runaway slaves continued to join them until the abolition of slavery. The main British complaint was that they occasionally raided plantations, and made expansion into the interior more difficult. These conflicts led to the First Maroon War in 1731 and the Second Maroon War in 1795. After which, approximately 600 Maroons were deported to Nova Scotia, and later in 1800 removed to Sierra Leone. The only Maroon settlement that remained after the Second Maroon War was Acampo, which had abided by its 1739 treaty with the British. Haiti, cimarrón. Dominican Republic, see History of the Dominican Republic. St. Vincent and Dominica. Similar Maroon communities emerged elsewhere in the Caribbean, such as St. Vincent and Dominica. See Garifuna. Cuba. In Cuba, there were Maroon communities in the mountains, where escaped slaves had joined refugee Tornos. Remnants of these communities remain to this day, for example in Via ± Ales. Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, Torno families from neighboring Utah were found living in the southwestern mountain ranges, along with the escaped Africans who intermarried with the Torno. DNA evidence shows that many Africans fled up the Camino Real into the mountains to escape the sugar plantations of Ponce. The Mandinka, Wolof, and Fulani mtDNA African haplotype, L1b, is present here. Torno haplogroups A and C can also be found in this area. South America, French Guiana and Suriname. Escaped slaves in French Guiana and Suriname fled to the interior and joined with indigenous peoples and created several independent tribes, among them the Saramacca, the Paramacca, the Ndiuka, the Quinti, the Aluku, and the Mataway. By the 1980s the Maroons in Suriname had begun to fight for their land rights. Brazil. One of the best-known quilombos in Brazil was Palmas, which was founded in the early 17th century. At its height, it had a population of over 30,000 free people and was ruled by King Zumbi. Palmas maintained its independent existence for almost 100 years until it was conquered by the Portuguese in 1694. Colombia. Escaped slaves established independent communities along the remote Pacific coast, outside of the reach of the colonial administration. In Colombia, the Caribbean coast still sees Maroon communities like San Basilio de Palenque, where the Creole Palencaro language is spoken. Ecuador. In addition to escaped slaves, survivors from shipwrecks formed independent communities along rivers of the northern coast and mingled with indigenous communities in areas beyond the reach of the colonial administration. Separate communities can be distinguished from the cantons Limones, Esmeraldas, Cajimas y Tababila. See also, Afro-Latin American, Black Indians, Black Seminoles, Capoeira, Cimarrón people, First Maroon War, Gaspayanga, Maria Elena John, Maroon music, Ndiuka, Quilombo, Saramacca, Second Maroon War, Sranan Tongo, Zambo. Notes. References: Daughters of the Dust, film by Julie Dash taking place in 1902 off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. It shows how, on an isolated island, a group of people manages to hold on to their Igbo customs and traditions. ISBN 0-525-94109-6, Ganga Zumba, film by Carlos Diaz, Quilombo, film by Carlos Diaz about Palmas, ASIN B0009WIE8E, Hoogbergen, Wim S. M. Brill, The Bony Maroon Wars in Suriname, Academic Publishers. ISBN 90-04-09303-6, Corzo, Garbino La Rosa, Runaway Slave Settlements in Cuba, Resistance and Repression, Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press. ISBN 0-8078-2803-3, De Granada, Germa N., Cimarronismo, Palenques y Hablas a Oe Criollas a en Hispanoma. Copyright Reconstituto Caro y Caro, Santa Fe de Bogotá, Colombia, OCLC 37821053, Van Velsen, Hue Thoden and Van Wettering, Wilhelmina, In the Shadow of the Oracle, Religion as Politics in a Suriname Maroon Society, Long Grove, Illinois, Waverlyn Press. ISBN 1-57766-323-3, Price, Richard, Maroon Societies, Rebel Slave Communities in the Americas, Garden City, New York. Anchor Books. ISBN 0-385-06508-6, Honeychurch, Lennox, The Dominica Story, London, Macmillan. ISBN 0-333-62776-8, Thompson, Alvin O., Flight to Freedom, African Runaways and Maroons in the Americas. University of West Indies Press, Kingston, Jamaica, ISBN 976-640-180-2, Learning, Hugo Prosper, Hidden Americans, Maroons of Virginia and the Carolinas. Garland Publishing, New York, ISBN 0-8153-1543-0, Campbell, Mavis Christine, The Maroons of Jamaica, 1655–1796, A History of Resistance, Collaboration and Betrayal, Granby, Massachusetts. Bergen and Garvey. ISBN 0-89989-148-1, Dallas, R.C. The History of the Maroons, From Their Origin to the Establishment of Their Chief Tribe at Sierra Leone. 2 vols. London, Longman 1803. Sergei Slepchenko, Nations of Latin America, Phoenix, Rostov-on-Don, ISBN 92-86-36414-2, Delorf, Sylviane A., Slavery's Exiles, The Story of the American Maroons, New York, NYU Press, ISBN 978-0814724378. Further reading, Cheney, Glenn Allen, Quilombo dos Palmas, Brazil's Lost Nation of Fugitive Slaves, Hanover, Connecticut, New London Librarium, 2014. ISBN 978-0-905,899-0-7, Johnson. Brian D. The Land of Look Behind, Equinox Magazine, September October 1983, ppA 49 €65. A detailed article with many superb photos. External links, Creativity and Resistance, Maroon Cultures in the Americas, A Good Short History of the Bush Negroes of Suriname, The Maroons, Hindustanis and Others of Suriname, The Maroon Culture of Endurance by Helen Riedel. A History of Jamaican Maroons. Also available in ARMA. Copyright Rika's Magazine, Volume 42, January–February 1990, ppA 46–49. Articles on Suriname Maroons and their culture in Dutch and English, music from Maluku, Maroon Sounds of Struggle, Solace, and Survival.